The door slammed so hard the walls trembled. "You'll never survive without me," Marcus shouted, dragging 2 suitcases toward the elevator, his voice echoing down the hallway of the apartment they had shared for 11 years. "You don't even know how to live without my money. You don't know how to live, period." Grace stood in the doorway, arms folded, saying nothing. He expected tears. He expected her to run after him, to beg, to fall apart the way he had imagined 100 times when he pictured this moment. Instead, she watched him struggle with the second suitcase's broken wheel, watched him curse under his breath, watched him refuse to ask for help out of pure, stubborn pride. "Say something," he snapped. Grace tilted her head slightly. "Did you forget your charger again?" Marcus's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. He turned, stabbed the elevator button 3 times as if that would make it arrive faster, and disappeared behind the closing doors without another word. Grace stepped back inside, closed the door, and locked it. Then, so quietly that only the empty apartment could hear her, she whispered, "We'll find out." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the marble lobby of a luxury high-rise in downtown Houston, staring at a single sheet of paper taped to the elevator bank. An eviction notice. His name typed clearly across the top. 60 days had already passed since the first warning. This was the final one. "This has to be a mistake," he said, snatching it down, his voice rising. "I know the landlord. I've met the property management company myself." The elderly man behind the concierge desk, Mr. Samuel Thompson, folded his hands and offered a small, knowing smile. "No, sir," he said calmly. "You know your ex-wife." Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but the words never came, because at that exact moment the glass doors of the lobby swung open, and Grace Bennett walked in wearing a tailored navy business suit, a leather folder tucked under one arm, a ring of master keys glinting in her hand. The confidence drained from Marcus's face, because the woman he had told the world could never survive without him now held the keys to the very building he had been sleeping in. If you're just joining us, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's rewind, because to understand how Grace Bennett ended up holding those keys, you have to go back to the beginning of a marriage that looked perfect from the outside and was slowly rotting on the inside. Houston has a way of making success look effortless. Glass towers catching the afternoon sun. Valet stands outside every good restaurant. Neighborhoods where lawns are cut in perfect diagonal lines. From a distance, Marcus and Grace Bennett looked like they belonged on a magazine cover for that kind of life. 2 successful professionals, a beautiful home in a gated suburb. Vacations posted online that made friends sigh with envy. Marcus worked as a regional sales director for a mid-sized logistics firm, a job that paid well and fed his ego even better. Grace worked quietly as a financial analyst, the kind of job people nodded at politely without asking too many follow-up questions. But behind the closed doors of their home, the dynamic was very different from what anyone assumed. Marcus needed to be the center of every room he entered. At dinner parties, he interrupted people mid-sentence to redirect the conversation back to himself. At restaurants, he insisted on paying the bill loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear the amount. He called himself, only half joking, the CIO of this marriage. He once printed out a mock certificate on cardstock and handed it to Grace during a birthday dinner with friends watching. It read, in bold gold letters, Employee of the Month. Wife Division. The table burst into laughter. Marcus beamed, clearly proud of his own wit. Grace smiled too, the practiced, patient smile of someone who had learned long ago which battles were worth fighting. There were other moments too, smaller ones that most people would never notice, but that added up over the years into something heavier than any single argument. Marcus liked to narrate Grace's decisions back to her, even the simplest ones, as though she needed his approval to function. When she chose a paint color for the hallway, he stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and said, "Are we sure about that? Feels a little dark, don't you think?" When she wanted to invite her college friends over for a weekend brunch, he'd ask, half joking, half not. Are they going to talk about their husbands' salaries again? Because mine's the only one that matters at this table. Grace would laugh it off in front of company and quietly file the comment away somewhere she stopped counting. At his company's annual holiday party, he introduced her to a room full of colleagues with the same line every single year. "This is my wife, Grace. She does something with numbers." Never analyst, never her actual title. Just something with numbers, delivered with a dismissive little wave of the hand, as though her career were an inconvenient footnote to his own. She corrected him the first 2 years. By the third, she stopped bothering entirely, because correcting him never actually changed what he said the following year, or the year after that. Every disagreement in their marriage, no matter how small, eventually circled back to the same sentence. "You'd be homeless without me." He said it when she disagreed about paint colors for the living room. He said it when she suggested they cut back on his car payments. He said it, laughing, when she mentioned wanting to attend a real estate seminar on a Saturday morning. "Grace," he'd said, shaking his head with the condescension of a man who believed himself endlessly reasonable, "real estate is for serious businessmen. Stick to your spreadsheets." She stopped mentioning it after that. Not because he had convinced her to stop, because she decided he no longer deserved to know. What Marcus never noticed, because he was rarely looking closely at anything that wasn't a mirror, was that Grace's lunch breaks had quietly changed. Where she used to eat a sandwich at her desk, she began disappearing for an hour and a half, sometimes 2, always returning composed, always returning without explanation. She attended small, unglamorous meetings in unglamorous conference rooms with property attorneys, contractors, and commercial brokers. She filed paperwork under her maiden name, Grace Bennett becoming, on legal documents no one in her personal life ever read, Grace Ellison. She built limited liability companies the way other people build hobbies, quietly, patiently, one brick at a time, never announcing progress, never asking for applause. Even Harold Jenkins, her attorney and one of her oldest friends, only knew fragments of the full picture. Every time she closed on a new property, she'd simply text him, "Another one done," and he'd reply with something dry like, "At this rate, you'll own the whole state before Marcus finishes paying off that car." She never argued with Marcus about money. She never had to. She simply kept building a life he didn't know existed. The cracks widened as the months passed. Marcus began staying out later, always with vague explanations. Client dinners, networking, golf outings that ran unusually long. He started upgrading things that didn't need upgrading. A new watch appeared on his wrist, the kind that costs more than a month's mortgage. Then a car, sleek and impractical, financed with numbers Grace happened to see on a statement she wasn't supposed to see, but didn't go looking for either. He wore expensive suits to a job that didn't require them. He was increasingly performing wealth rather than building it. Then came Vanessa Brooks. Marcus didn't hide her. That was the strange, almost prideful part of it. He introduced her publicly at a company event, his hand resting on the small of her back, while Grace stood 20 feet away making polite conversation with a co-worker's spouse. Vanessa was 39. Glamorous in the deliberate, curated way of someone who photographed every meal before eating it, who treated designer handbags the way other people treat family heirlooms. She laughed loudly at Marcus's jokes. She looked to anyone watching like exactly the kind of woman Marcus had always wanted people to believe he deserved. When he finally sat Grace down to tell her he was leaving, he seemed to believe he was doing something noble. "I think it's important I'm honest with you," he said, hands folded like he was delivering a keynote speech. "I've met someone, Vanessa, and I think it's time I stop pretending to be happy here." He waited. He expected tears, pleading, maybe even anger he could point to later as proof she was unstable. Instead, Grace looked at him evenly and asked one simple question. "Have you packed everything?" Marcus blinked. "What?" "Your things," she said. "Have you packed everything, or are you planning to come back for more later? I'd like to know how many trips this is going to take." He stood there, stunned, his prepared speech collapsing somewhere behind his eyes. He tried to recover his dignity by launching into a long, dramatic monologue about growth, about needing more, about deserving passion instead of routine. Grace listened for exactly 4 minutes before quietly walking to the hall closet, pulling out the vacuum cleaner and turning it on. Marcus's voice was swallowed by the whir of the motor. He stood in the middle of his own farewell speech, mouth moving, no one listening, visibly offended that his wife had chosen that moment to clean the carpet. "You know what your problem is?" Marcus said, pacing now, his voice climbing louder with every step. "You never fight for anything. You just sit there, calm, quiet, like none of this matters to you. Well, it should matter. I'm leaving, Grace. Do you understand what that means?" "I understand English, Marcus," she said. "I understood the first 3 times you said it." "There it is," he snapped, pointing a finger at her. "That's sarcasm. That's exactly why—" He stopped himself, shook his head, and softened his voice into something almost pitying. "Look, I know this is going to be hard for you. I know you've built your whole life around this house, around us. I just want you to know, when you need help, and you will need help, I'll still take your calls." Grace set the remote down on the coffee table with deliberate calm. "That's generous of you." "I mean it," he said. "You don't have my income. You don't have anywhere near the credit I have. You've never had to build anything from nothing the way I have. I don't say this to be cruel. I say it because it's true." He grabbed his keys and stormed toward the door. "You'll regret this," he said, voice cracking with wounded pride. "Drive safely," Grace replied, not even looking up. That was the scene that led to the slammed door. The suitcases. The words that would come back to haunt him in a marble lobby 6 months later. What Marcus never predicted was what came after. Everyone around Grace, her sister, her co-workers, even Harold, braced themselves for a collapse. They expected the woman who'd built her entire adult identity around being calm and accommodating to fall apart the moment the marriage that defined her ended. Instead, something unexpected happened. She began to breathe. The first Friday night alone in the house, Grace sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she'd made just for herself. No one to comment on the brand, no one to ask why she wasn't drinking something stronger to celebrate. She allowed herself, for the first time in years, to simply sit with her thoughts without performing composure for an audience. She cried a little, not out of regret, but out of relief. The specific kind of relief that arrives after holding your breath for far longer than you realized. Then she wiped her face, finished her tea, and went to bed early, sleeping more soundly than she had in months. From there, the days took on a rhythm entirely her own. She watched an entire season of a show without anyone changing the channel mid-episode to check sports scores. She bought a $9 coffee on a random Tuesday without a lecture about wasting money on lattes. She danced, actually danced, barefoot in her kitchen while cooking dinner for one, laughing at herself for how long it had been since she'd done that. She slept diagonally across the bed for the first time in over a decade, and she woke up the next morning surprised by how good it felt to take up space she used to apologize for. Meanwhile, Marcus was discovering that Vanessa's love came with a price tag that updated daily. Designer shopping trips, weekend brunches at restaurants that didn't list prices on the menu, memberships to clubs whose entire purpose seemed to be photographing champagne glasses for social media. His savings, once healthy enough to fund the illusion of effortless success, began thinning out with alarming speed. But Marcus's pride was a stubborn thing. He didn't slow down. He didn't admit anything was wrong. He simply kept spending, convinced that admitting a mistake was somehow worse than making one. If you've made it this far, comment, "I'm still here," because the biggest twist hasn't happened yet. And trust me, Marcus has absolutely no idea what's coming. To understand what Grace had really been building all those years, you have to go back further, long before Marcus ever met Vanessa, long before the slammed door and the suitcases with broken wheels. Years earlier, Grace had inherited a modest sum of money from her late aunt, a woman who had spent her own life working 2 jobs and never once complaining about it. Most people in Grace's position would have used that money for something visible, a bigger house, a nicer car, something to show off at the next family gathering. Grace bought a duplex instead. Small, unremarkable, in a neighborhood that wasn't fashionable yet. She rented out both units, reinvested the income, and bought another property a year later. Then another. Whenever she mentioned it to Marcus, even in passing, he laughed the idea off entirely. "Real estate is for serious businessmen," he told her once, waving his fork like the subject bored him. "Stick to your little spreadsheets, babe." She remembered the exact tone of his voice, the exact way he said little, as though her ambition were a hobby he was humoring. She stopped explaining herself after that conversation. Not because she stopped believing in what she was building, because she realized he would never see her clearly enough to deserve the explanation. One property became 3. 3 became 7. 7 became 20, spread across Houston in careful, unglamorous increments. A small office building here, a retail strip there, a modest apartment complex that needed renovation but had good bones. She learned zoning laws on weekends. She learned how to read a rent roll the way other people read novels. She built relationships with contractors, with brokers, with an investment group that eventually approached her directly about becoming majority owner in a luxury apartment complex downtown. Sleek, modern, the kind of building young professionals bragged about living in. There were nights, early on, when the weight of building something alone felt almost unbearable. She remembered one closing in particular, on her 5th property, when the seller's attorney raised an eyebrow at the paperwork and asked, almost condescendingly, "Is your husband going to be signing as well?" Grace had smiled, pen already in hand. "My husband isn't part of this," she said simply. "This one's mine." She drove home that night with the windows down, playing music too loudly for a Tuesday evening, feeling something she hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph exactly, but proof. Proof that she could build something entirely her own, brick by brick, without needing anyone's permission or applause. Harold had asked her once, over coffee, why she never told Marcus the full extent of what she owned. "Wouldn't it be satisfying," he said, stirring his cup, "to watch his face when he finds out?" Grace considered the question seriously before answering. "It's not about hiding it from him," she said. "It's about not needing him to validate it. The moment I start building things to prove a point to Marcus, it stops being mine. It becomes about him again. I've spent enough of my life being about him." Harold hadn't argued with that. He rarely did. When Grace spoke with that particular tone of certainty, the one that made further debate feel entirely unnecessary. Neither Grace nor Marcus had any idea, at the time, that this very building would one day become the site of his unraveling. Life, it turned out, had already started writing its own quiet joke, years before either of them noticed the punchline forming. After the divorce papers were signed and Marcus moved into that same luxury building with Vanessa, his life outside the apartment began crumbling in ways he refused to acknowledge, even to himself. 3 months after moving in, he lost his executive position at the logistics firm. The result, according to the termination letter, of repeated performance concerns and unauthorized expense reporting. Marcus told no one, not his friends, not Vanessa, certainly not Grace. Every morning he put on a suit. He kissed Vanessa goodbye, grabbed a leather briefcase that now held nothing but a phone charger and old business cards, and left the apartment like a man, heading to an office that no longer employed him. He spent his days in coffee shops, nursing $5 lattes for hours, using the free Wi-Fi to scroll job listings he was too proud to apply for. "So," a young barista asked him one afternoon, after noticing him at the same corner table for the 4th day in a row, "aren't you supposed to be at the office or something?" "I'm working remotely," Marcus said smoothly, without missing a beat. She nodded, unconvinced, and went back to steaming milk. By the 3rd month, even she had stopped believing him. She'd watch him arrive at 9 sharp, order the same drink, and sit motionless for hours, occasionally muttering to himself while staring at his phone. Regulars started whispering. Marcus noticed the whispers and pretended not to. One evening, alone at the kitchen counter while Vanessa was out with friends, Marcus opened his banking app and stared at the number on the screen for a long time without moving. He closed it, reopened it, as if the balance might have quietly corrected itself in the time between glances. It hadn't. He thought briefly about calling Grace. Not to apologize, not exactly, just to hear a voice that had once, despite everything, always been steady. He scrolled to her name in his contacts and let his thumb hover over it for almost a full minute before locking the phone and setting it face down on the counter. His pride wouldn't let him make the call. It never had. Instead, he did what he always did when reality became uncomfortable. He bought something. A new pair of shoes, ordered that night. Arriving 3 days later in a box, he hid at the bottom of the closet so Vanessa wouldn't ask questions about spending. It didn't fix anything. It never did. But for about 11 minutes after the confirmation email arrived, he felt, briefly, like the man he used to pretend to be. Meanwhile, Vanessa remained completely unaware, continuing to post photos of 5-star brunches and new handbags with captions about living her best life. She had no idea the credit cards funding that life were quietly maxing out, one luxury purchase at a time. Reality, the kind that always eventually shows up uninvited, was closing in. Fast. Rent on the penthouse became overdue, then 30 days overdue, then 60. Marcus received the warning letters and threw them into the trash without reading past the first line, convinced that men who looked successful always found a way to get second chances. He genuinely believed, on some level, that his charm alone would be enough to talk his way out of consequences the way it always had before. Mr. Thompson, the property manager, tried to handle the situation with patience. He knocked politely. He explained the timeline calmly. Marcus, humiliated and defensive, responded by dismissing him outright. "Mr. Bennett," Thompson had said the first time, standing in the hallway with a folder tucked under his arm, "I want to be transparent with you. You're currently 45 days past due. I'd hate for this to escalate further than it needs to." "There's clearly been a mix-up with billing," Marcus said, already stepping back to close the door. "I'll have my assistant look into it Monday." Mr. Thompson, who had worked in property management long enough to recognize a stall tactic when he heard one, simply nodded. "Of course. I'll follow up Monday then." Monday came and went. So did the following 3 Mondays. Each time, Marcus offered a new excuse, delivered with the same practiced smoothness he'd once used to close sales deals worth 6 figures. A payment processing error, a bank transfer delay, a miscommunication with his accountant, who, in truth, no longer existed because Marcus had stopped paying for 1 month earlier. "Look, I don't have time for this," Marcus snapped one afternoon, barely opening the door. "You're just the maintenance guy, right? Tell whoever's actually in charge that I'll handle it." Mr. Thompson's expression didn't change. He simply smiled, the kind of small, controlled smile that carries more weight than any raised voice ever could. "I'll remember that," he said quietly, and walked away. The final notice arrived 3 days later. Marcus glanced at it, scoffed, and tossed it onto the kitchen counter. Vanessa, without even reading it, set her wine glass directly on top of it, the condensation blurring the ink into a faint gray smear. "They're bluffing," Marcus said confidently, refilling his own glass. "Buildings like this don't actually evict anyone. Too much liability, too much bad press." He had no idea how wrong he was. Across the city, in a quiet, sunlit office, Grace sat across from Harold, reviewing a stack of documents related to a delinquent tenant in one of her buildings. She wasn't personally involved in the day-to-day management. That was what property managers like Mr. Thompson were for. But the final eviction authorization for units in default required her signature as majority owner. She signed without pausing, the way she'd signed dozens of similar documents before. Routine, business, nothing personal. Then Harold, scanning the paperwork for the file, went suddenly still. "Grace," he said slowly, "did you actually read the tenant's name on this one?" She looked up, confused by the change in his tone. "Harold, I sign these every week. What's different about this one?" He turned the paper toward her, tapping the line with the tenant's full legal name typed in plain black ink. Marcus Bennett. The room went silent. Grace stared at the paper for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "What apartment?" she finally asked, her voice quieter than usual. "Penthouse," Harold said. Grace closed her eyes briefly, exhaling through her nose, somewhere between disbelief and something that almost resembled amusement. Harold leaned back in his chair, shaking his head slowly. "Life," he said, "certainly has a sense of humor." Eviction day arrived with the quiet efficiency of routine business, at least until Marcus stepped off the elevator and understood exactly what was happening in his lobby. Moving trucks idled outside. A sheriff's deputy stood near the front desk, holding a clipboard with practiced patience. Property staff moved quietly through the lobby, and curious neighbors gathered near the mailroom, pretending to check for packages while watching everything unfold. Marcus pushed through the doors, his face red, his voice already rising before he'd fully crossed the threshold. "This is insane. I demand to speak to whoever actually owns this building." The elevator chimed behind him. The doors slid open. Grace stepped out. Navy suit, composed posture, the same leather folder tucked under her arm that she'd carried into countless closings over the years. She walked forward with the calm, unhurried confidence of someone who had done this exact walk 100 times before. Except this time, everyone in the lobby understood the moment carried a weight none of the previous times had. Marcus laughed, a short, nervous, disbelieving sound. What are you doing here?" Grace accepted the folder Mr. Thompson handed her, flipped to the marked page, signed it in one smooth motion, and then held out a separate document toward Marcus. "I'm here," she said evenly, "because this building belongs to my company." For a moment, Marcus simply stared at her, waiting for the punchline, waiting for someone to admit this was some elaborate joke. It never came. Vanessa, standing a few feet away with 2 suitcases she'd hastily packed, looked back and forth, from Marcus to Grace, to the eviction notice still clutched in her hand, and finally back to Marcus again, her expression shifting from confusion to something colder. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched long enough to feel physical. Then Mr. Thompson, ever composed, broke it with quiet finality. "I believe your 7 days expired yesterday, sir. If you're still watching up to now, type 'I'm still here' in the comments, because what happens next is the moment everyone's been waiting for." Marcus opened his mouth to argue, some old reflex trying to summon the confidence that had carried him through every difficult conversation of his adult life. Nothing came out. For the first time that anyone in that lobby could remember, words simply abandoned him. Vanessa didn't wait for him to recover. She set her suitcase down with a sharp click and looked at him with an expression that made it clear exactly what she was thinking. She hadn't signed up for this. She had wanted the version of Marcus that paid for everything without flinching, the version that made people turn their heads in restaurants. She had never wanted a man standing in a lobby, publicly humiliated, unable to pay rent on an apartment he didn't even own the right to be angry about losing. "Vanessa, wait," Marcus said, reaching for her arm. "This is a misunderstanding. Give me a week. I'll sort this out. I promise." "You told me you owned a piece of this building," she said, her voice low and sharp, cutting through his sentence like she'd been waiting months to say it. "You told me you had money coming in from investments. You told me a lot of things, Marcus. I was going to save it." She picked her suitcase back up. "I need to make some calls," she said flatly, already walking toward the door, leaving her second suitcase behind for Marcus to deal with. He didn't chase after her. He couldn't. He was still staring at Grace, trying to reconcile the woman standing in front of him, poised, unshaken, undeniably in control, with the version of her he'd spent years dismissing at dinner tables and mocking over spreadsheets. "You," he said finally, his voice smaller than Grace had ever heard it. "You own this building?" "I own several," Grace said simply. "This one included." "But how? When? You never said anything." "You never asked," she replied. "You told me real estate was for serious businessmen. So I decided to be one, quietly, and let you keep talking." Marcus opened his mouth again, searching for something. Anger, sarcasm, the old confidence that used to fill every silence he found uncomfortable. Nothing came. He looked around the lobby, at the sheriff's deputy waiting patiently by the door, at Mr. Thompson holding the clipboard with quiet satisfaction, at the neighbors who had stopped pretending not to watch. Everything he had spent years building, the appearance of success, the illusion of control, collapsed in the space of about 90 seconds, in front of an audience he could not talk his way past. "Grace," he said finally, his voice cracking in a way it never had before, not once in 11 years of marriage. "Please, just give me a little more time. I can figure this out. I just need—" "You had 90 days, Marcus," Grace said. And for the first time that afternoon, something almost gentle passed across her face. Not pity exactly, but something close to it. "I'm not doing this to hurt you. This is simply how the process works for every tenant in this building. I don't make exceptions. Not for strangers. Not for you. So that's it. 11 years, and this is how it ends? In a lobby, with a sheriff standing next to you?" "No," Grace said quietly. "It ended 6 months ago, in our old apartment, when you told me I'd never survive without you and walked out the door. This is just paperwork." He had no response to that. None at all. Word of what happened in that lobby spread quickly, the way stories always do in a city where everyone seems to know someone who knows someone. Marcus's old colleagues heard versions of it within days, some accurate, some exaggerated beyond recognition. A few reached out with hollow sympathy that barely masked their curiosity. Most simply went quiet, the way people do when they've decided a story is more entertaining to whisper about than to engage with directly. Marcus spent the first few nights after the eviction in a budget motel off the highway, the kind of place he would have refused to even acknowledge existed a year earlier. He lay on a stiff mattress staring at a water-stained ceiling, replaying the moment the elevator doors opened again and again, searching for some version of events where he came out looking less foolish. He couldn't find one. There wasn't one. In the weeks that followed, the full picture became impossible to ignore. Vanessa left almost immediately, exactly as everyone but Marcus had predicted. She had never wanted him, not really. She had wanted the version of success he performed so convincingly. Once the performance ended, so did her interest. Marcus discovered, slowly and painfully, exactly how much Grace had built during their marriage without ever touching a dollar of his income. Every property, every LLC, every careful, patient decision had been funded by her own discipline, her own inheritance, her own quiet refusal to give up on herself, even when the person closest to her refused to take her seriously. That realization hurt him more than losing the apartment ever could. He had spent years telling her she would never survive without him. The truth, unfolding in front of him in that lobby, was the exact opposite. She had never needed him at all. She had simply loved him, and there is a profound difference between those two things. One requires dependency, the other requires choice. Grace had chosen him, for years, despite never needing him. And somewhere along the way, he had mistaken her patience for weakness, her silence for permission to underestimate her. Months passed. Grace's real estate company continued expanding, acquiring new properties across Texas. each acquisition handled with the same quiet discipline that had defined every step of her journey. She began mentoring young women in her community, teaching financial literacy workshops on weekends, sharing what she'd learned about patience, discipline, and building wealth without needing anyone's applause or approval to validate the effort. In one of her early sessions, a young woman raised her hand and asked nervously, "What do you do when the people closest to you don't believe in what you're building?" Grace paused for a long moment before answering. "You let them not believe," she said. "Belief was never the requirement. Consistency was." She never mentioned Marcus in these sessions. She didn't need to. Her results spoke clearly enough on their own. Marcus, humbled in a way he'd never experienced before, eventually found honest work, a modest sales position, far smaller than his old title, far less impressive on paper. His new manager, a soft-spoken woman roughly his age, reviewed his resume during the interview and asked simply, "There's a gap here, a few months. What happened?" Marcus considered lying, the way he once would have without a second thought. Instead, he said quietly, "I lost my job, and shortly after, I lost a lot of the things I thought defined me. I'm rebuilding." She studied him for a moment, then nodded and moved on to the next question, seemingly satisfied by the honesty more than she would have been by any polished excuse. For the first time in his adult life, he introduced himself at gatherings without mentioning his salary, without needing the room to be impressed by him within the first 30 seconds of conversation. It wasn't redemption exactly. It was something smaller and more honest than that. The slow, uncomfortable beginning of humility, built one quiet, unremarkable Monday at a time. One afternoon, as Grace toured a newly acquired apartment complex with her management team, a young employee walking beside her asked the question people had started asking more frequently. "How did you become this successful? I mean, really, what's the secret?" Grace paused near a window overlooking the property, considering the question for a moment before answering. "The loudest person in the room isn't always the strongest," she said, her voice calm and unhurried. The same voice that had once absorbed years of dismissive comments without ever raising in volume. Sometimes the quietest person is simply too busy building something no one else can see yet. The employee nodded slowly, writing nothing down, but clearly understanding the weight of the answer. Outside the window, the Houston skyline stretched wide and golden in the late afternoon light, towers of glass and steel that had taken decades to build. One careful decision at a time. Much like the life Grace had quietly constructed for herself, brick by brick, while everyone around her assumed she wasn't paying attention. There is a lesson buried in Grace's story that reaches far beyond the walls of that lobby, far beyond one marriage or one eviction notice. Never mistake someone's silence for weakness. Some people don't waste their energy proving their value to those who refuse to see it. They simply keep building, quietly, patiently, until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Marcus spent years measuring his worth in volume, in watches, in cars, in the size of the room he could command with his voice. Grace measured hers in patience, in discipline, in decisions made without needing anyone's permission or applause. In the end, one of those foundations held. The other one collapsed the moment reality asked it to prove itself. Thank you so much for staying with this story all the way to the end. We hope Grace's journey reminded you that quiet strength often outlasts loud confidence, and that real security is something you build for yourself brick by brick, long before anyone else notices you're doing it. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear from you. Comment below and tell us what part of Grace's journey you enjoyed the most. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story of patience, resilience, and well-earned karma.